Hello and welcome everyone to an interview with Andrew Basiago, a childhood participant in the program Project Pegasus as a child, later in the Jump Room to Mars program, currently a lawyer and planning to run for President of the United States in 2016. And Andrew's been watching in the background and doing his own research on the discussion that has kind of exploded on the scene lately, being that of the flat Earth. And it brings up a lot of questions in regards to some of these secret space programs, what they claim to have achieved. And it answers a lot of questions, not just for those of us who are on the outside looking in, but also for some of the insiders. And I've been wondering when or if we would actually have anybody from any of the official space programs, any of the official public astronauts come forward and speak up for or against. So far, that hasn't happened, but today we have Andrew Basiago. So, welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me, Lisa. It's good to be with you again.
Yes, we did speak back in 2012, I believe it was. It's been a while.
I think so. I think you interviewed me about my experiences in DARPA's Project Pegasus, which was the U.S. timed space program in the early 1970s, of which I was a child participant. That was shortly after I had been approached by two of my fellow U.S. chrononauts, William Stillings and Bernard Mendez, about my involvement in the CIA's Mars Jump Room program of the early 1980s. And I was hoping that we could look at some of the abiding mysteries of that program today and relate them to the emergent flat Earth arguments that are being, I think, successfully waged by people like Matt Boylan and Eric Dubé. I spent the better part of the holidays in kind of we used to do escape reading. Now we do escape surfing on the internet. You'll have a week or two just to free up your mind and explore things that are of great curiosity to you. And for me, that was some of these flat Earth arguments that are being made, which I find quite logical and compelling. And I was excited by the fact that a flat Earth model solves four of the major mysteries of what was actually happening in the so-called Mars Jump Room program.
Okay, can we start there with those four mysteries? What are they for you?
Well, just to recap, in 2010, I was approached by William Stillings. I had been completely amnestic about what I did during my 4 college years at UCLA from 1980 to 84. Brett had heard me on Coast to Coast AM on 11/11/09 and said, wait a minute, this guy's talking about this time travel program he was in childhood in the early 70s. But I remember that as being part of his background when he served with me in the Mars Jump Room program of the early 1980s. I could not access those memories because they had been electronically suppressed. The program administrators were using a form of brainwashing that involves suppressing memories. So they kind of sanitized us as potential whistleblowers at the end of our jump room experiences, which for me, and I think probably for both William and Bernard, occurred around spring of 1984. So I've gone back now, and after Brett contacted me in April of 2010, in hundreds of hours of consultation with Brett and with Bernard Mendez, I was able to go back and recapture about 40 jumps that I did from essentially a space elevator that was located at a Hughes aircraft facility in El Segundo, California, immediately south of the Los Angeles International Airport.
Just to interject, Bernie Mendez, is that how I pronounce it? Bernard Mendez?
Right, that's correct. Or Ben, we also call Bernie Benny, is to his closest friends.
It was both of you that I interviewed back in 2012, and if people want to go back and have a listen to that interview, it's fascinating, and it will give you a lot of background in what's being discussed today.
Right. We talked about how in the early 80s we were brought into a program under the Central Intelligence Agency in which there was a space elevator in the CIA complex beneath the George Washington Bridge in New York City, known as the East Coast Jump Room. And then there was an identical facility in the elevator that was in the central core of a building at 999 North Sepulveda Boulevard in El Segundo, California, literally the southern perimeter of the Los Angeles International Airport, which is Imperial Avenue east and west. If you take that east for about a block from the airport, you cross Sepulveda Boulevard. And today there are three big, if any of your listeners find themselves in West Los Angeles, today there are three big red nines at that intersection. But in the early 80s, that building was owned and operated by Hughes Aircraft, not their headquarters building in El Segundo, which is farther into the city plan of El Segundo, farther south, but right there in the southern perimeter of the Los Angeles International Airport. And we would go into that elevator. We would take it up to the 5th floor and check in where there was kind of a Fijian suite, just a kind of a marble desk with one Central Intelligence Agency employee who would take our name, our social security number, our date of birth, and our signature. We would then go back into the elevator and in our street clothes without any specialized clothing, go up to the 8th floor. We would be in the elevator with the door closed for about 5 minutes. Then after 5 minutes, lights would start flashing on panels that consisted of about a foot high and then a foot from the ceiling of this normal elevator, such as you would find in any corporate office tower anywhere in the developed world. And then after about 10 minutes, the elevator would start morphing from a box-like structure into a cylinder. So we would have to right ourselves with one of our hands, as if in the way that you do when you walk through a cylindrical water main. But we would just stand there, and at the end of the cylinder, what had been the ceiling of the box-like elevator had migrated in front of us as the structure became a cylinder. And there would be the clockwise spiral of a wormhole forming at the far end of the elevator. And that process would last about 10 minutes in a 20-minute flight, and then it would correct itself, and then about 5 minutes later, the door on the opposite side of the elevator would open, and we would find ourselves in the sub-basement of a U.S. facility on what the program administrators had told us was the planet Mars. And we had different experiences just going there, kind of having acclimation trips, sort of training missions, just going up there. Then we had a set of exploratory missions where I was in a team of 3 that consisted of Bernard Mendez as the team leader, with our fellow chrononaut of my generation, Barry Soetoro, who later changed his name to Barack Obama and is now President of the United States. And I was also paired frequently in an exploratory team of 3 that consisted of Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA and my fellow trainee, William Stillings, who would approach me on April 23rd of 2010 and remind me that I'd been in this program with him. So then we had about 10 exploratory missions, and then I was given an actual mission, which was to take a computer disk that I would pick up at a Rand Corporation subsidiary, not in Santa Monica, California, but in West Los Angeles. Rand is in Santa Monica, but this subsidiary was in West LA. When I was a student at UCLA, I would drive over there, be given the disk, and this was a 3.5-inch disk in the nature of what we would end up calling a floppy disk, even though it was rigid, which would emerge about 10 years later in the commercial sector. This was being used in the Intel community as early as 1981. And I would drive over to the Hughes building in El Segundo and go into the elevator and check in on the 5th floor, and then go to wherever they were sending us from the 8th floor. Now, as William and Bernard and I began to consult each other on Skype, with Bernie in his lifelong residence in Staten Island, New York, with Brett in Los Angeles, California, and myself in Vancouver, Washington, which is basically a suburb of Portland, Oregon. we began to compare notes about what had happened to us during those 4 years in the early 80s. What emerged was basically a gentleman's agreement to disagree. Essentially, with grossly generalizing, Brett adhered to the position that we were going to the actual Mars in real time, namely the planet that you can see with your telescope. And among the arguments he made was that we can't rely on NASA to give us the true science of the planets because they've been lying to us all these years about everything. He said, for example, how could you sustain a parachute landing of the Mars rovers, Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity, with a Martian atmosphere of only 8 millibar? Brett estimated in one calculation that it would take a parachute the size of the continental United States to gently land one of the rovers on the surface with essentially what NASA claims is no atmosphere. All three of us remembered the blue skies that we encountered on Mars, and oxygen is a clear gas that refracts blue. That's why our skies on Earth are blue. And we all agreed that when we arrived there, there was a blue sky, kind of a baby blue, a pale blue sky, but blue enough so that we could see the Martian moons Phobos and Deimos demarcated in white against a background in the sky that was blue enough for us to see the moons, let's say in the late afternoon. And other sound arguments where Brett basically said, look, that's what they trained us for. That's where they were telling us we were going. We were going to Mars. Bernie, on the other hand, who had more extensive involvement than Brett and I in the secret space program, here was somebody who had been a liaison to different ET civilizations during an entire career. Bernie is kind of the Indiana Jones of human ET liaison on behalf of the United States government. He even claims to have met El Supremo, the supposed long-necked gray who was kind of the supreme allied commander of this part of the galaxy that we're under a common government of. And Bernie insisted that there were a set of criteria that indicated we were not going to the actual Mars, but we were going to an artificial holographic planetary domain that I invented the term SQE for synthetic quantum environment. Bernie described for us at length, I think on that broadcast that you did in the co-interview with me on the Lisa M. Harrison show, that the Apollo astronauts called these synthetic quantum environments folds in time-space, that the gray ETs had found a way to create, in a sense, synthetic terrestrial environments that were trapped in these folds that were both underground in the Earth, on the surface of the Earth, and in the heavens. And I think Bernie said at that time he stated that there were, and he still is, I would imagine if we asked him, but I think he said there were about 53 of these folds in space, these SQEs, that the American space program had identified. Now, I sat back and said, wait a minute, we were apparently going to the real Mars. For example, Brett described on his first jump how he bent over and tasted the dirt of Mars, literally physically tasted it, and it tasted like dirt. I remembered the rust red dust of the terrestrial environment we were going to, being challenged upon my return to California by both my dear late mother at our home in Chatsworth, California, and one of my fellow undergraduates at the University of California at Los Angeles, when I literally walked in to a history lecture with the red dust of Mars on my hiking boots. She asked me whether I was working construction to get through college, and I said, no, actually, if I told you what's on my boots, you wouldn't believe me. And she said, well, give me a shot. And I said, Mars. I said, that's the rust red dirt from Mars. And she said, you're kidding me. And I said, no, I'm going to Mars. I'm in a secret space project where we're taking a space elevator. And when we walk from the sub-basement of the place they're sending us up to the surface, we are on Mars. And we were trained to go there. Okay. But hearing the kind of legitimate arguments that both Brett and Bernie were making, I took the middle position. You may recall that I said, I think we were going to the actual Mars, but maybe at least sometimes it involved some form of chronovision in which sometimes we were there physically and sometimes maybe we were just there virtually or holographically. Because there were a set of incidents that indicated that at some point at least, we were being kept within the bounds of a kind of a holographic quarantine when we were visiting
Yes,
this
there was one
terrestrial
incident that
domain
stood
that
out for
certainly
me.
looked like
Yeah.
one.
Sorry, I think my internet's a little bit
Yeah,
unstable.
no. Please share that with me, because there were several. But what one did we share with you back in 2012?
That you were armed and fired a shot upward, and it clearly hit a shield, the ceiling. You know.
Right. That's how bizarre. That's how bizarre this program was. That was a flare that was fired from a pistol that was provided by Bernard Mendez to Barry Soetoro, who's now president of the United States. And it went up. I was there. I was standing there. We were in that team of 3 on that particular mission. And it hit something as if we were in a dome. There was another time when Courtney Hunt, my other team leader, and I walked about, about a half mile from the jump room facility that we called the Corkscrew, because it had a basic conch shell design. We would literally walk around an inclined plane, as you would if you were tracing the configuration of a conch shell, a Fibonacci series essentially, up to the surface. And we bumped into something that was essentially an invisible force field and couldn't go any further. You may recall, I don't know if we told the story of the night run that we did with 3 of the women in the project, Regina Dugan, Mary Jean Eisenhower, the granddaughter of President Dwight Eisenhower and the aunt of the whistleblower Laura Magdalene Eisenhower, and another female who we've not been able to identify by name. But we went up at night and we found ourselves being chased by these quadrupedal dinosaur-like creatures. But as we were, our footfall was being indicated by a light on the ground, as if we were running around this parquet disco floor on the dirt of another planet, which made absolutely no sense. And that bespoke some kind of virtual or holographic reality.
Sorry, I'm getting images of like Avatar of a nighttime when he touches the planets and things and they light up. You're talking about that kind of as your feet hit the ground?
Yeah, it was Bernie's idea. We actually took a nap at a U.S. Army intelligence dormitory in West Los Angeles, over near LAX, over near the airport. We then were driven by this nameless individual. It wasn't even a taxi ride from there to the El Segundo jump site. And we went up at night, and when we walked out of the cave-like entrance of the Corkscrew, as it sort of vented out onto the surface of what we believed was Mars, it was so pitch black that Bernie actually got a mirror that he affixed with some chewing gum to the end of a rod, and we looked out the mouth of that cave-like aperture of the Corkscrew that gave us egress to the Martian surface. And shortly thereafter, we were walking actually 4 by 1. We were walking, the 4 of us. Actually, excuse me, it was the 5 of us, Bernie and the 3 gals and I, and we were walking along the surface with our arms locked, and somebody said, "There's something behind us." And we spent the next 15 minutes running all over hell and tarnation in that immediate area, not just with the bizarre element of being chased by these predatory, small, brontosaurus-type dinosaurs, but I actually had my arm ripped off. And you may recall that one of the mysteries was that my arm reformulated when I was being interviewed by Bernard Mendez and Major Ed Dames in the sub-basement level of the El Segundo jump room site that we returned to after the jump. And I believe that Regina was legitimately beside herself. She was crying heavily. It was terrifying. And I was shook up as well. So there was a few incidents. There was another incident in which one of the young men got bitten to death by one of the large, inevitably predatory dinosaurs, inevitably lethal predator dinosaurs, which were about 16 feet tall and were sort of Tyrannosaurus Rex-like heads on velociraptor bodies. And they would chase somebody until they were exhausted and then bite them to death. And that when we went back to reclaim his body, to get his body, there were several essentially causal loops that we experienced where the same set of experiences were recapitulated when we went back to Mars. as if it was a holographic reality that was sort of skipping or replaying our original experience. And that, curiously, was the one jump that I did with my late father, Raymond Basiago, who was one of the experts on teleportation, who was then employed, as he had been since 1966, we're talking 1984 here, as a special projects engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, which I've since learned, even since that interview, with Lockheed Skunk Works of Burbank, California, was the two Southern California based engineering companies that in a joint venture with CIA had actually assembled the jump room program, were responsible for the jump room program, in the same way that Parsons had been the major defense contractor on Project Pegasus and had essentially been the defense contractor responsible for creating a time travel capability for DARPA, for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, back in the 70s. So Brett's father, for example, Thomas, worked for Lockheed. My father worked for Parsons. And that was the sole jump that my father did. But in going back to retrieve that young man's body, it was a young man from Southern California named David. Going back to get David's body, we had two causal loops of the same set of events. The difference being that with the second and third replaying of that set of events on the surface, as we all went up there in teams of 2 and 15-minute intervals, and about 8 of us joined up on the surface, the second and third jump involved the awareness that we were having like a deja vu set of experiences in real time, where we knew we had just done what we were doing, which was very bizarre. So these virtual exceptions to the mere terrestrial experience of Mars gave Bernie pause to insist that we weren't visiting the actual Mars in real time, but we were being sent elsewhere. So I concluded that it was the actual Mars via, for example, we could see Deimos and Phobos in the sky, and they were in the right trajectory and relative location and so forth from what we had learned in our training. Our training was all centered around the real Mars. Of course, the temperature was more commodious. We were neither frozen to death nor incinerated on the surface. Yes, the air was thin of oxygen, but we could barely breathe, but we could breathe unassisted. But still, that was at variance with how much oxygen is supposed to be on Mars, which is very little. So, we had a sustainable level of oxygen, even though the science books say that there is not a sustainable level of oxygen on Mars, and that's something that can be ascertained from our planet, or at least via telescope, the oxygen content of the Martian atmosphere. So it was weird. It was a weird set of, if we were going to the actual Mars, there were some real hard science exceptions, but there was more than incipient evidence. There was what was becoming substantial evidence that, in fact, we were being sent elsewhere. So when I encountered the flat Earth literature in December, not only was I blown away by the logical and compelling nature of the arguments that are being raised, but I started to correlate what was being claimed with what we were experiencing in the jump room program. And I think this is kind of an historic interview, because we may be able to link up some of the flat Earth literature with the Mars jump room literature.
What really caught your attention in regards to this flat Earth initially?
Well, first of all, I completely concur with the argument of Matt Boylan that all of us, for the most part, only know or only believe as a kind of a universal constant, as a cosmic fundament or fact, that the Earth is spherical because we've been told that's the case. And in my truth campaign about my time travel experiences and my Mars jump room experiences, whatever, in fact, we'll ultimately learn the Mars jump room program was and what we were actually doing, I've always taken the position that I only share what I know. If somebody asks me a question and I just don't know, I say, something? I don't know. I didn't experience that. I wasn't told that, whatever. I just don't know. But I've tried to guide by my own experience, because there's a great discrepancy between what we directly experience and what we are told on the one hand. And we also have very bad memory. I found in my research into my own experiences, most people have very bad memories. Most people are very imitative in what they believe has happened to them in terms of the conclusions that they draw. And most people are unscientific. I like to say that a scientific person bases their findings on what they experience, not on their beliefs. But others formulate a worldview based on their beliefs, not their findings. To be scientific, you have to base your beliefs on your findings, not your findings based on your beliefs.
Even within the flat Earth community
and
itself,
so
there are a variety of arguments for what we're actually looking at. You know, an enclosed system or not,
right,
an infinite system,
right.
You know.
So I was drawn to the fact that my belief that the Earth is spherical is simply imitative, and I would urge most people to consider that fact. I mean, and then when we start exploring instances in which we do tend to see the potential spherical arc of the horizon, well, the curvature of airplane windows explains that. When you look at the footage of even the amateur rocketry up into space, you continue to see a flat horizon. And after I started to propagate some of this arguments on my groups on Facebook, people claim that they've sat in certain island locations, mountainous island locations, and been able to take a straight edge and literally hold it up and see that the far ends of the straight edge belie an arced descending curvature, indicating that the Earth, while very big, 25,000 miles in circumference, is nonetheless a sphere, but nobody could send me a photograph of that. And so the first major thing I had to admit was that their argument that most of us believe the world is round and not flat is because we've been told. I find that very compelling. I have to admit that in the same way I urge people to suspend their belief about time travel as I share my true experiences, I have to be just as honest with Matt Boylan and Eric Dubay, and admit that I believe that the Earth is round because I've been told that it's round, not because I've witnessed it. In fact, in the Mars Jump Room program, we remained inside the 6 planes, the 4 walls of the space elevator, never saw the Earth from space. The other arguments they get more and more complex from that. But as I surveyed them over the Christmas holidays, I had a very sinking sensation, as did several very intelligent friends that I shared the data with. We had kind of like, I don't know how to describe it. It was sort of a frightening empirical metanoia, in which we said, you know something? Anybody who's fair-minded has to acknowledge that the advantage in this argument goes to the flat earthers. And the implication of that is that there's been a 500-year multi-generational cover-up that for some reason has tried to purport a round Earth rather than a flat one. And then you go into, well, why would that be? Well, that could be the effort of a secret society to somehow give an alternative empirical framework for our existence that's contrary to, let's say, to Scripture. I don't know. It's just a really disturbing reality to wake up. I mean, Lisa, I'm 53 years old, and I've been told my whole life, and I've been shown NASA pictures of a round Earth. But if, as Matt has described, NASA has been illustrating the round Earth, and that was the second thing that really got me, is if we're putting all these satellites and space probes into space orbit and near Earth in orbit, why can't they provide moving real-time images of the round Earth? And why are they hiring brilliant photorealistic artists like Matt Boylan to simulate a round Earth if they've got the opportunity to take so many real-time photographs and motion picture or video images of the round Earth? Why would there be any need for fabrication?
Why indeed? And as you said, you sort of posed the question as to why. And the only conclusion I can come to on that is what it does is how it reduces us, isolates us, and makes us somewhat insignificant in this current.
Yes, I was reminded by this. Sorry. Right. Sorry, I'm sorry to overspeak you. I was reminded of the discovery that Hart Crane had that I think made him actually suicide by casting himself off the front of a ship, if I'm not mistaken, when he woke up and found the world ungodded. If you look back at the last history of the evolution of science, religion, and philosophy, that my mentor Norman Cousins predicted would one day be integrated in what he called the blessed event, where those three disciplines would be unified in a kind of a social science unified field theory. But the bottom line is that the propagation of the round earth has made us isolated philosophically in the third rock from the sun. It's had the effect of ungodding our reality so that we see ourselves as the ultimately, at least personally, doomed occupants of a random spheroidal usufruct out, on the spiral arm of a branch of the Milky Way galaxy, approximately 65 million light years from the relative center of that galaxy, with utter obscurity as a species, no intentional divine purpose to existence, but just what we could frame through secular humanistic reasoning, but not any inherent godded or divine purpose to the creation of the world, or indeed the divination of our own existences. And that has led to...
Sorry, again, we've got a bit of a delay. It also answers to me the question of why such destruction is being allowed to happen. I mean, if this really is it, if we are it's just this ball and we've got nowhere else to go, why would such destruction of the planet be even considered, let alone pursued with such vigor in the course of chemtrailing and mining and pollution and everything that's going on this planet? How could that be allowed to happen if this is it? To me, it actually does explain why that's allowed to happen, because somewhere somebody knows there's more land, there's somewhere else to go. It doesn't make sense otherwise to completely destroy your own home.
And in addition to that, on the philosophical and political level, if you believe there's no God and that the world is not a stage, not a moral stage, individuals and corporations are free to pursue their own ends in terms of environmental destruction, the propagation of wars, in which merciless tortures are meted out even on human children, with no fear of divine retribution. And certainly the framing of the scientific revolution post-Copernicus, of course, Copernicus not being the first to frame the heliocentric theory of our solar system, that was the work of Aristarchus of Samos back during the golden age of the Greek civilization. But essentially this modern scientific revolution, we date roughly from the time of Galileo Galilei, the High Renaissance, the 1450s. That post-Copernican, post-Galilean reality has been one in which increasingly ferocious wars and increasingly rapacious resource extraction have dehumanized society and begun to destroy the physical environment. And I'm wondering whether people would do that if they knew that there would be personal moral retribution for their violent acts, and that they were literally tearing away at God's creation if the world had not been ungodded by the scientific revolution. And then you raise the point of, if there is an oligarchy administering all this environmental destruction and unceasing warfare, maybe they're doing so from an investment perspective because they know there's other lands beyond Antarctica. If Antarctica is in fact an icy barrier around the circumference of a flat Earth rather than the icy mass at the bottom of our spherical Earth, as the flat Earth adherents describe it, which I also find very compelling. If you look at the map that is in use by the UN, that was the third thing. There's no North Pole, and yet the map is designed from a bird's eye view above the North Pole. There's no Antarctica per se, although there's a circle around the map that could stand in for Antarctica. And if you go south, really from any port on the world island, you ultimately hit Antarctica. But who's gone to the center of it? And why is the U.S. Navy preventing people from exploring Antarctica? Is that actually preventing people from leaving this quarantined flat Earth on a cosmic plane that includes other lands and other installations?
Well, yeah, they haven't really put forward
so that
any
was
compelling argument as to why it's a no-go zone.
Yeah, why would there be a no-go zone that the U.S. Navy would be spending resources to prevent people from exploring, especially after the different nation states that reached and settled Antarctica supposedly have carved up Antarctica into different protectorates or territories? Why would there be a need to prevent anybody from going there? Is that in fact a border patrol on a flat Earth rather than a military force protecting the icy mass at the bottom of a spheroidal Earth? That was the third thing that got my attention, is that the UN has been using a map that would cohere to the basic configuration of a flat Earth. So those are just some of the sort of more rote measure simple factors. I'm not really conversant as of this broadcast into some of the more arcane arguments, although I did watch a number of private space launches that have gone literally into outer space and not shown any curvature of the horizon. In fact, the horizon stays at the level of the viewer, which would indicate a cosmic plane that goes on forever. So I started to relate that to some of the mysteries, the abiding and remaining mysteries of the Mars Jump Room program and what we were really doing in that program. And should I just enumerate all four of them sort of here in prescript, just to get a handle on?
Yes, please.
On what the enigmas of the Jump Room program were. The first one was, if we can imagine ourselves in the jump room in El Segundo, it's beginning to morph from a box into a cylinder. And the far end of the jump room, by that I mean the wall opposite the door that we walk through, is now starting to morph into a clockwise twisting wormhole-like configuration. That never changed. A wormhole that emanates out from you, in front of you, with no turn to the left, right, no convolutions of twists and turns, demarcates, from my perspective, a linear flight path. And all three of us described the wormholing at the far side of the jump room. And yet, we also described how it was depositing us in the sub-basement of a U.S. jump room facility on the Red Planet that was obviously a moving planet, if we were to believe astronomy's claim that Mars is in a heliocentric flight path or orbit around the sun. In fact, an irregular one that causes Mars to move towards and away from the Earth in its 2-year irregular orbit around the sun. And the problem about that was raised initially by Bill Ryan, formerly of Project Camelot, today at Project Avalon. In listening to me describe my jump room experiences, Bill said, how could it not be a dynamic wormholing process if your destination was in a dynamic orbit toward or away from you? And we all just glossed over that. One of my friends informed me that I system.
Sorry, can I just recap on
Sure.
Essentially what you're saying? Right. How do you land on a moving target when you're traveling in a straight line?
Exactly, because Mars is in a 2-year irregular orbit around the sun that causes it, as we go around our circular orbit around the sun in a much truer or regular way. Mars, therefore, as an object, a speck of dirt in the sky that we were trying to hit with whatever form of teleportation was being used, it would require that we twist and do what Dr. Buzz Aldrin developed to allow for the lunar landing, which is some calculus-based model of moving towards an object that's changing its position in space as you're trying to reach it. That's a dynamic model. That can't be a one straight shot. And the three of us were describing how the jump room, at the end of the jump room, it morphed into a perfectly regular spiral that we were describing as a wormhole, but we were looking at the center of the wormhole. We weren't looking at a wormhole that, let's say, was banking sharply to the right or the left or up or down as we were going on this apparently linear flight path towards what we were told was the red planet. So there was a logical disconnect there. We were stating that we were going towards a moving target, but we were describing a linear flight path that could only cause us to land on Mars through sheer luck. If somehow, just like when you pick up a dart and you hit a perfect bullseye, that's just sheer luck. You've hit the very center of the target. We could have hit Mars, but there was an astronomical probability we would not have hit the dynamically moving Mars on a linear flight path, the linear flight path that we were describing. So I kind of put that issue aside. I think one of my friends said that your answer was, well, I'm not a physicist, so I can't answer that. Well, I'm not a mathematician or a logician either, but as simply a 53-year-old, I can say there's no way we should have been able to hit the actual Mars on the linear flight path. It's anathema to the very nature of Earth and Mars orbiting the sun, with Mars being a kind of a random flight path that causes it to move towards us and away from us, depending where we are with it in that 2-year cycle. Okay, so we were stating something that was impossible, except if it was the highly improbable good fortune of just randomly hitting it with our flight path. And they would have had to do probably 1 million flights for us to just hit it and land on Mars one time. But they were sending us there every time without injury. In fact, one time the jump room walls fell away and disintegrated, and Bernard and I were rolled onto the surface and battered pretty badly. But we actually had, in other words, an arrival in which we were thrown out on the surface of Mars like a pair of dice. Okay, so how were we doing that?
Like being
so
thrown
Bill
from
Ryan
a
was
moving
right.
vehicle. How's that happen?
A basic thing. Yeah, it's like saying, you're getting in a taxi in Wichita, Kansas, and saying, driver, take me to Los Angeles. I want you to drive straight there, regardless of the twists and turns of the highways. Just, set your car at the sun and go west. It's impossible on a spherical planet, and likewise, it's impossible in a spheroidal model of a heliocentric solar system with both the Earth and Mars being dynamic elements. Okay, so we all tabled that issue and didn't explore it, but in fact, it was actually a threat to the validity of our claims, because in not addressing it, we were leaving open the question of how a linear flight path could land on a moving Mars, or a Mars that was simultaneously moving relative to the Earth's movement, which was also dynamic in nature. So that was the first question that had not been answered as of my inquiry into the flat Earth literature. Would you like to hear number 2?
And valid. Totally valid.
and valid. It's a valid point. I'm striving to be as scientific as I would commend the flat earthers for, because far from being lunatics, they're some of the only truly scientific reasoning people that I've heard in a long time in the public domain. I mean, I've had to listen through Dr. Stephen Hawking, Dr. Michio Kaku, Dr. David Deutsch, and Dr. Ronald Mallet, literally of what? The University of Cambridge, the City University of New York, the University of Oxford, or Oxford University rather, and the University of Connecticut, give interviews as supposed experts on time travel about how time travel is one day going to be possible. And I first time traveled over 40 years ago. So as an individual, I've become quite tired of listening to ostensible scientists who are not using basic logic. And I was very impressed by Matt Boylan and by Eric Dubay, because they're reasoning publicly in a purely scientifically valid way. And this is what we need to do in the 21st century. So the second question that I think they may have provided answers to, I'm not sure, but I think they're worth discussing, is how could we be getting to a planet millions of miles away in only minutes? You may remember that when Bernard and I testified, or we appeared on your show and supported each other's testimony, two very different individuals. One, a career intelligence officer for the U.S. Department of Defense and the CIA, the other a lawyer. Bernie and I have some things in common. We were in the jump room program together, where I grew up in New Jersey within a stone's throw of New York City. I had relatives who were from Brooklyn and the Bronx. And so I can relate to Bernie, but we're two different chaps, all things being equal. But we were supporting each other's testimony that we were entering this room in either, the George Washington Bridge CIA complex in New York City, or the Hughes building in El Segundo, right near the Los Angeles International Airport. And it was morphing anywhere from 8 to 20 minutes. And then we were stepping out on a planet that was millions of miles away. Nobody did the math, and nobody stated the obvious, which is if the claims of U.S. chrononauts Basiago, Stillings, and Mendez are even to be entertained, if we're to assume arguendo that they're sane and they're telling the truth, which we are, all three of us are both sane and truth tellers, then we can only conclude that we could not have been going to the actual Mars because the actual Mars was too far. What kind of supersonic wormholing could have allowed us to go millions of miles with no apparent sense of acceleration, no deracinating, nauseating sense of acceleration? There was a nauseating sense of vertigo from the twisting that the jump room provided. But the speed required in the ordinary Einsteinian universe that we live in indicates that Mars was too far to get there in only a few minutes, even if we were teleported. For example, when I was going from 1972 to 2045, a period of roughly, 78 years, in the Stargate at Cerritos, it still was taking 30 seconds to get to not go anywhere very far spatially, but temporally to go 78 years. So we all kind of ignored the fact that the three major claimants, and then of course our accounts are supported by those of Michael Relf, Arthur Neumann, and then also the invitation that Laura Eisenhower was given to relocate to the Mars colony. And let me mention a discovery I made after I spoke with you, Lisa, which is in her initial discussion with Alfred Lambermont Weber and I, Laura stated that the people who were trying to recruit her to the Mars colony stated that she would be going there via ARC. And I had ignored her statement in my 2011, I believe it was 2011, it may have even been earlier, it may have been 2009, I guess it was 2010 or 11 with Alfred, that ARC was the acronym that we were given for the jump rooms. It didn't mean ARK or some kind of lifeboat for Earth. They were actually referring to the technical term for the aeronautical repositioning chambers, which was the jump rooms. But still, whatever Mars is would have to be subject to the flat Earth form of the solar system if the flat Earthers win the argument. But I just wanted to mention that something that Laura had said in her first interview with Alfred and I, her first interview by Alfred with me, essentially. She had no way of knowing that we had been told in our training that the jump rooms inside the intel community were known as aeronautical repositioning chambers, or ARCs, when you refer to that as an anagram. So anyway, but the question still remained, how were those aeronautical repositioning chambers teleporting? So we traversed millions of miles between Earth and Mars. If that light in the sky is a terrestrial sphere that can be landed on and reached through some human conveyance. That was the second question, is basically the distance problem. As
so
of today,
at the time, do you all just put it down to a technology that's beyond your understanding?
I think we wrote it off to experience, and we said, and I think again, I'm not criticizing any of the Mars jumpers who came forward as whistleblowers, or Laura's sort of unique status as somebody who was invited to go up there who declined and then later became a whistleblower around the recruitment effort and essentially verified the Mars program 25 years after Basiago, Stillings, and Mendez went up there, and 40 years after Michael C. Relf first went up there in 1976. And of course, Arthur Neumann's account is an independent account. It's independent of the Relf account. It's independent of the account that William and Bernard and I gave as former colleagues. But as to the distance issue, I think everybody ignored it. We kind of whistled past the graveyard and didn't make it an issue, when in fact, our whole narrative as a group of whistleblowers is pregnant with the question, okay, if we're to believe all you people, how did you take a teleporter and get there in, let's say, 8 minutes? Andy, you said that Mars was supposedly moving closer to Earth, and that enabled your father to be medically approved to go in 1984, despite his cardiac and pulmonary deficits, because he would only have to be in the oxygen deprivation of the jump room for 8 minutes, and then on the surface for a short period with the medical orderly in attendance, which is how they set my dad up. So that gave rise to my proof that we were going to the actual Mars, which is one of the reasons I tended to believe William rather than Bernard on that question of whether or not we were going to the actual Mars. Because as Mars moved towards Earth, and we checked this out, Mars did in fact move closer to Earth in the 1983-84 timeframe. It was sort of peaking in its nearness to Earth in its 2-year irregular orbit. And so my dad had been approved on that basis to go, that one jump we did. And then we'd go, and the causal loops occurred when we went up there 3 times in the same day. But notwithstanding that fact, all of us were saying, look, it didn't take us months or years to get to the red planet. We were getting there in minutes. And because our claims were heretical, essentially we weren't subjected to scientific scrutiny regarding the distance problem. So everybody sort of wrote it off to experience and ignored it. And then I thought, wait a minute, we were making the claim, and we stand by the claim that the program administrators were telling us that we were going to another celestial body millions of miles away in minutes. And if you compare the order of magnitude problem, it becomes logically untenable that even with teleportation we could have done so. It would have taken maybe several days via a nearly instantaneous form of teleportation. In other words, it just should have taken us longer in the jump room, probably long enough so we would have asphyxiated in the closed jump room from oxygen depletion. And while we always tried to go alone, or maybe at most with one other jumper, sometimes with 3 jumpers, if they were particularly diminutive people. Like there was a time, let's say, when I went up with Courtney Hunt. I was 180 pounds. Courtney was about 160, and maybe with her guy Nadugan, who was about, $110, soaking wet. Sometimes we would hazard that, but we always tried to control the number of jumpers in the jump room at 2, so we wouldn't literally asphyxiate in the jump room. Particularly if for some reason the jump was extended by minutes. Nonetheless, we ignored the distance problem. And there may be an explanation for that in a flat Earth scenario.
Why weren't you able to take any kind of, and I have a feeling you did answer this way back, but any breathing assistance apparatus in the jump room with you, if that was the case?
We did on the first jumps. And in fact, yeah, I was a saxophone player. I don't know if that was qualifying, but for example, I had no problem inflating my lungs and letting it out for minutes. I was never able to do what, when I was in junior high school, a kid in a neighboring high school could do, which is breathe in through one nostril and breathe out through the other nostril and play his soprano saxophone without interruption for minutes. But then again, I wasn't Kenny G. That was Kenny G doing that in my local high school, Kenny Gorlick. But I did have excellent respiratory performance. Now I have pretty compromised respiratory performance just from probably my project exposures. But I brought a respirator on my first jump in July of 1981 that Courtney Hunt had showed me how to use at an abandoned chemistry lab at Cal State University Northridge, which is now the University of California at Northridge campus in Northridge, California. And so we were all equipped with this rudimentary oxygen machine that you could actually hand pump. And William Stillings, being only 14 when he started jumping, would sometimes use that. But for the most part, most of us, almost all the time, including Brett, were breathing unassisted on the surface. And I would pretty much concur with Brett's estimate that having been, let's say, the highest I've been on Earth is at 7,200 feet in Flagstaff, Arizona. I'm not a mountaineer, despite the fact that I'm a graduate of the Cambridge College that Mallory went to. Mallory, of course, being the great British mountaineer who, when he was asked why he climbed Mount Everest, he said, because it was there, and because it's there, and died on Everest. And they recently found his body. But I'm not a mountaineer. I've never been above Flagstaff, Arizona in terms of altitude. They did take us up to Mount Baldy in San Bernardino to see if we passed out or began hyperventilating at a mile high or whatever Mount Baldy is. Maybe 7,000 feet, I don't know, 5,600 feet, something like that. But Brett estimates that we were basically at like the Everest level. We were at like 14,000 feet in terms of oxygen supply. But by just not getting too excited and not locomoting too aggressively on the surface, we were able to breathe the atmosphere. But I remember getting shooting pains, really stabbing, excruciating pains in the thigh and calf muscles as a result of hypoxia, which is oxygen deprivation, after, let's say, 2 hours of normal walking.
I was going to say, how do you stay calm? How do you stay calm when you're being chased by dinosaurs?
Yeah, and how do you stay calm when you know you're millions of miles away from your home planet on another planet, and you're not going to get home if the jump room breaks down? During my years at UCLA, when I was jumping, I was actually stuck for hours with a co-ed at UCLA there on an elevator in one of the dormitory buildings at UCLA in Reber Hall, and had to not freak out as we were essentially captives within the narrow limits, the confined limits of a dormitory elevator. So, in a wider sense, when we were on the surface of Mars, I was in love with life. I certainly didn't want to die on another planet. I had a lot to do with my life. I wanted to grow up and be somebody and get a lot done for humanity during my lifetime. My heroes were people like Buckminster Fuller and Jacques Cousteau, and people who, your Benjamin Franklin's, people who live honorable lives to 84 and get a lot done for our race, our one human race during their time on our planet. And so I didn't want to check out on the red planet. And I was always apprehensive about the fact that the oxygen supply wasn't very good. We were getting the early stages of hypoxia in terms of cramping, like really severe cramping. This would be about 5 to 10 times more severe than you can get in a swimming pool. And man, we pretty much were showing that we had true grit by not bringing respirators, but we really could have used them. And yet we didn't even have them sometimes because we left them back in El Segundo.
So have you actually had conversations now with Stillings or Mendez or anybody else around the flat Earth? And
no, I'm taking the opportunity. I'm taking the opportunity to review these 4 points with you before talking to them about them. Because, for example, number 3 is whether we were visiting Mars at all. In other words, if the CIA had found a way to take these jump rooms, whether they were a Parsons-Lockheed joint venture technology that had been evolved, or whether they were reverse engineered from ETs, or as Bernard has stated, they were given to the U.S. government by one faction of the gray ETs. And I always talk about the grays being factions or typologies or species, because many of the 70 or more species that have been visiting us are one form of gray or the other. So one faction of the gray ETs gave the jump room technology to the U.S. government, according to Mendez. I have no evidence of that, and I have contrary evidence that the jump rooms were developed in a joint venture between Parsons and Lockheed. But then again, if they had been reverse engineered from ET craft or literally given to us by the grays, there would have to be brilliant physicists and electrical engineers like my dear old dad on the project and Brett's father, because they would have had then to have been adapted to human use. So I think it's pretty moot. We know Parsons and Lockheed were involved. We also know that Bernie's statement that we were under observation by the grays during our jump room activities is true, because I described, I think, when I was on your show with Bernie back in 2012, that one time we came out of the jump room. I was leading Courtney Hunt and William Stillings out of the jump room called the Corkscrew, and I saw a gray ET up on the roof of the building, and I yelled, "Court, Brett, a gray!" on the roof observing us. So we were under direct observation by at least one gray ET type creature. But then again, if the program was telling us that, hey, you're going to Mars, and they were actually sending us to a much closer location that was simply a rust-red desert environment like Sedona, Arizona, but under the flat Earth conception, was elsewhere, not millions of miles away in heliocentric orbit. My point here is that the flat Earth literature begs the question of whether it was the actual Mars. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe we weren't visiting Mars at all, like Bernie had stated. And if Bernie was correct that it wasn't the actual Mars, where was it? Where could it have been so that it was reachable within minutes? So that's kind of a synthesis of points 2 and 3. And then the final one is, what explained the force fields that were sometimes encountered on the surface of the environment to which we were being sent? There's no commonsensical explanation for humans going to an inhabited planet in their solar system, seeing both the Homo martus terras ETs that are essentially our genetic cousins, they being the descendants of the humans that were on Mars from the first civilization on Earth, the one that was destroyed in the solar system catastrophe around 11,500 BC, that the civilization that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, and probably the great platform of Baalbek in Lebanon, that was a spacefaring civilization, which explains why Pharaoh Akhenaten was the sun god, that he was literally Pharaoh when the high Egyptian civilization reached the rest of the solar system through some revolutionary flight technology.
But
so if we go there,
it brings all of that into question too. Well, it
actually
brings all of that into question too. I mean, it actually brings everything you just said into question as well, in terms of what they've achieved and where they went. I mean, if all they did was go next door to the neighbor's to the neighbor's yard, which is entirely possible. I mean, it's so much more possible.
Right, and my research organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, found the face of a pharaoh, a mixed-raced pharaoh with both European and African features, which could have been one of the pharaohs during the reign of the so-called the Black Pharaohs, when the high Egyptian civilization was so advanced that after they were at war with the Ethiopians, who I believe are described as the Cushites in the Old Testament, if I'm not mistaken, they did something brilliant, which is they adopted the brightest children from the Ethiopians and raised them in their leadership cadre. So they made some of the alpha men and women of the next generation of Ethiopians their leaders, their own leaders, in a kind of a political power sharing with the Ethiopians to put an end to several generations of internecine warfare, because all warfare is internecine, right? So the Egyptians figured that out. Hey, we won't kill ourselves off killing our brothers if we create a common leadership cadre of basically white and black pharaohs. So this carving of a pharaoh that we found, curiously taken by the rover Spirit on its 2012th soul on the red planet. There's the 2012 number again, but not the year 2020, but simply the 2012 day or soul, Martian day of the rover Spirit's journey on Mars. There we have the utterly indelible image of a pharaoh with mixed-raced ancestry, both white and black, with the distinctive conical headdress of the pharaoh, with the cobra ready-to-strike motif that was the symbol of Lower Egypt, that became the symbol of all of Egypt during the reign of the pharaohs. So there we have both the conical headdress and the cobra image, which proves that it was from the high Egyptian civilization. That was found by Ross Curley of Mars, one of our more gifted photoanalysts. And I think it's just, the Rosetta Stone of the human, the pre-Atlantean human Earthling presence on the red planet. But again, if the flat earthers are correct, then they weren't going, they were, as you said, they were just going next door to place that presence on the red planet in antiquity.
So if you had no
shot via teleportation over the Antarctic ice barrier to some flat terrestrial environment, synthetic or otherwise, it really doesn't matter, because it was a real place we were going to. And all of the jumpers, when confronted with the question of whether or not it was the actual Mars, I think it's fair to say that Welf and Neumann and Basiago and Stillings and Mendez, and for that matter, Randy Kramer, who came, Captain Randy Kramer, who came forward recently, stating that he spent 17 years on Mars after reaching it by advanced spaceplane, that wherever it was in the cosmos, it was a real terrestrial domain. Now, where would these terrestrial domains be if they're not the lights orbiting in a dynamic heavens above the Earth? They would be another settlement colony out on some kind of cosmic plane. And if that's not 1,000,000 miles away, that answers question 3. I was teleporting, for example, from the old Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, to the state capitol complex in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the New Mexico State Capitol Complex, in several seconds. Now, that's a distance of 2,005 miles. If you add in 10 years of technical development, is it possible that we were traveling several tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of miles on a divine plane, on a cosmic plane, beyond the Antarctic ice sheet, but nonetheless not millions of miles into space, but a far closer distance to those areas where there's terrestrial development projects underway, like Earth is underway? And that when we talk about a flat Earth, we're really talking about this, pizza pie shaped colony on a flat cosmic plane where there's other such quote unquote planets. We should really talk about them as planning projects if the flat earthers are correct, right?
Yes, exactly.
So the first question of a linear flight path, you can't reach a moving planet in a linear flight path achieved by a linear wormholing effect, but you sure can go nearly straight out from that 8-story building and just land 8 stories below you, X tens of thousands of miles or hundreds of thousands of miles on a cosmic plane that the flat Earth is situated on, where there are red rocks and dinosaurs and things, and a commodious temperature that is not as hot and cold as Mars is supposed to be. So that's consistent. Flat Earthers.
If you look at one of the models in terms of how the sun and our moon operates above our Earth, our little pocket of territory, then with Matthew Boylan's hypothesis, you've essentially got that duplicated all over the place, and each one has its own sun, and then 1 or 2 or 3 moons, whatever works. And so the environment you experience, the blue sky, seeing the moons, that's all explained in maths model.
Exactly. That we were taking basically a cannonball shot over the Antarctic ice barrier of a flat Earth and reaching it in hundreds or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of miles, not millions, providing that really sharp order of magnitude problem in terms of distance over time. And that explains the linearity of the flight path and the nearness of the destination. And that actually that obviates question number 2, was that we reached it because it was far closer than millions of miles. Now, what explains, so if the flat Earth model solves linear flight path, not millions of miles away, but much closer, and the visiting not of the planet Mars, but simply of a rust-red terrestrial realm near to the Earth, near to the flat Earth on the cosmic plane. So we conceptualize under that model a flat Earth that doesn't fall off and cause Columbus to go to fall into space, but a flat Earth that is simply this pizza pie kind of terrestrial realm on a much larger or infinite cosmic plane. Then suddenly all you have to do is find one that looks like Mars to believe you're going to Mars. And let me also mention this. I'm not sure that Bernie mentioned this when we appeared with you back in 2012. He later informed me in defending his theory that we were visiting a synthetic quantum environment that we began to call SQE subprime Mars, small case MARS, synthetic quantum environment Mars, that Ed Dames revealed to him in the early 80s when we were jumping that, hey, we know we're not sending these kids to Mars, we're sending them elsewhere, but we're not really sure where we're sending them, but don't tell them. Now that's very damning. I'm sorry, I had to come forward publicly and share that. It's been eating at my guts, because if we were to assume arguendo, Bernard is telling the truth, and he has done nothing but tell the truth to me, personally and professionally, for years. He even remembered how I teased him how he looked like a turtle when he showed up to pick me up for that night run, and he had his green army sweater over his backpack. So Bernard is he's a fuss budget for details like I am, and he's a truth teller. So Bernie has revealed that Ed Dames revealed to him, by the way, that's not hearsay. It's hearsay as to Ed Dames saying it, but it's direct testimony as to Bernard hearing Ed Dames say it and reporting it in his testimony. That means that the person who trained us was aware during the time that we were serving that we weren't going to the terrestrial Mars, we were going elsewhere, which again begs the question of where. Okay. Under the flat Earth model, it wasn't Mars and the sky. Sure. Can
I also just ask, Ed's always denied any participation in this, hasn't he?
He has, but he has the testimony of 3 reliable people who have no history of false statement, insanity, intoxication, drug abuse, or anything that would be a threat to credibility. What is it? Intoxication, infancy, and insanity are the 3 forms of the disability of a witness. Well, we're not children, we're not crazy, and we're not intoxicated on drugs or alcohol, as we make the claim that we each corroborate the other. So that's 6 independent corroborations. The 3 of us each corroborate the other 2. So that's 6 courtroom corroborations of our claim that he was our instructor in the summer of 1980 and that he was Major Ed Dames. In fact, we even have the name of his girlfriend and where she was from. Her name was Mary Ann, and she was from Valencia, California. Now, he stated on Coast to Coast AM that he could not have been our instructor that summer because he was in Germany following Soviet troop movements from the Czech border. But in fact, we remembered him telling us that at the end of the summer, he was going to be repositioned, relocated in the Army to Germany, and that Mary Ann was refusing to go with him, and they were breaking up as a couple. So anyway, to us, it was the real Dames. If we were in another timeline that Ed was not in, this Ed Dames was not in, we extend to him our apologies. But in fact, in terms of linking him to the program, we've refused to apologize as a trio because we've lauded the quality of his education, which from our perspective as time-space explorers caused us to survive what we were put through by the United States government. Ed was an excellent instructor. He's probably, I did 6 degree programs after high school, and he was probably the most incisive, brilliant educator in terms of making us remember the key information that we needed to know.
For him to be in the position of your instructor and not be fully informed, absolutely, as to where you were going, that if he couldn't even be certain, then
that's what Mendes reported.
Yeah, how compartmentalized is the information if he even doesn't know? Because he can't fully train you for all possibilities if he's not entirely sure of where you're going.
Exactly. And let me flesh out sort of the scenario there. I'm an undergraduate at UCLA, right? I'm taking a history degree program in the day division, and they've dropped me into a strategic intelligence program under the Naval Postgraduate School at night. So I'm getting like 36 extra quarter units of Navy intel stuff that my counselor confronted me with during my exit interview in fall of '83, before my June 1984 graduation from UCLA. So I'm literally undergoing saturation learning in American history and in naval intelligence in 2 baccalaureates. And in fact, I followed my instructions from the Navy program and declaimed that degree. It would have been a 2nd baccalaureate in advanced mathematics if I had claimed it. So I only left with a BA in history from UCLA. So I'm really being pushed to the limits of my cognitive functioning, getting very little sleep between fall of '81 and spring of '83. Periodically, I'm receiving a message in my pigeonhole, excuse me, in the dorms where I was staying, instructing me when I was going to jump. So it would say like, Andy, come to El Segundo Tuesday at 10:30 in the morning. And whatever class I would have to miss, mostly of my history program, I would then have to fake it on the final exam, because I would then be driving over to West LA to pick up the computer disk, and then drive over to El Segundo with that, and then go up to Mars, or what we were told was being Mars. When I'm getting back, I'm sitting in Ed Dame's office, and he's going through that thing that is kind of associated with the remote viewing program. Is, okay, tell me what you saw next. And we would be debriefed scrupulously by Ed after each return. Okay, what happened next? You saw that? Okay, what happened next? What did you see next? What happened next? And he would take down notes about what we said we were seeing on the surface. Nonetheless, we had real-time telemetry of our heartbeat, our blood pressure, and our respiration. One time I started hyperventilating on the surface, and I was asked through this microphone they had up in our ears. We had like an adhesive pack on our chests, which I hated, in which they would follow our vitals. And we could talk to El Segundo through just by talking on the surface. So there they had a form of radio that was, as instantaneous as what we're experiencing right now here on cell phone from my feed to your station in the early 80s. So I got a little bit off point, but my point is that I'm in this environment where I'm getting the saturation learning, and I'm periodically doing these jumps for the secret space program, and I'm coming back and being debriefed by a scientific and technical intelligence officer for the U.S. Army, Major Ed Dames. I believe he was then Captain Ed Dames. At the time he was just starting his remote viewing stuff, or that his website said he started his remote viewing stuff in 1982. And he's not sure where they're sending us. Maybe that's why he was taking such scrupulous data about what we were seeing, because they had determined that it wasn't the terrestrial Mars. Maybe they finally got a proof that it could not have been Mars, because Mars swings, to 200 degrees, minus degrees Fahrenheit, and 150 degrees above 0 Fahrenheit, and would cause us to either be incinerated or frozen to death on the surface. I don't know. I do know that he was taking very scrupulous notes, and he was a great instructor, and I credit him with my survival during the program, because when we would describe a certain scenario, he would say, well, you best could have handled it this way. And then he would describe what we should have done. And we were also being supervised very well. I remember one time I discharged my weapon. I was one of the guards on the project, one of the protectors, and I was commissioned with a photo flash gun that had 3 settings: heat, stun, and kill. And that's why when lighting somebody's cigarette, the watchword was "do the right thing," and set your gun to heat before lighting a cigarette for your fellow jumper, because if you accidentally set it over in the left side and did the left thing, you might accidentally burn their head off and kill them. But so I had a photo flash gun, and I used it one time to break open a rock. Curiously, some water burbled from the rock, like a little freshet, like a little spring. And that really angered Courtney Hunt, that I had discharged my weapon on the surface for no reason. He thought I had shot a Martian life form. We had actually received ethical counseling that if we wanted to do so, we could sacrifice ourselves rather than using our weapons defensively to save our lives and potentially foment an interplanetary war, or at least engage in exoplanetary killing. That ethically we could choose to suicide rather than kill a life form on another planet or potentially foment interplanetary war. Fortunately, I never had to fire on anything, because the life forms that we had direct contact with were so big that all I would have done was aggravate them and ended up getting eaten, like the fellow chrononauts that I was witnessing getting eaten when I could have used the weapon. There was nothing small enough or vulnerable enough to use, or human enough to use the device on, the weapon on. So it was a scary project, and here we are being managed by Ed Dames, you know, Dr. Doom, Mr. Gloom, or whatever his sobriquet is. You know, the man who says we're going to be incinerated by a kill shot from the sun. And according to Mendez, U.S. Chrononet Bernard Mendez, during the time we were on the project, Ed Dames revealed to him that the project itself had determined that we weren't being sent to the actual Mars, but that the young jumpers that included myself and Barack Obama and Regina Dugan, future space shuttle pilot William Cameron McCool, and William Brett Stillings should not be told. So hey, I'm telling it now because they didn't let us into the Tea Party to know that they had determined we weren't going to the actual Mars. But that is Bernard's testimony. It's certainly not my testimony because I heard neither hide nor hair of any such concept when I was on the project. They were always, in my view, reinforcing the idea that we were going to the actual Mars. Now, the planetary domain we were sorry.
No, you've actually got my mind spinning in a bunch of different directions, and none of them specifically relate to what we're saying. So I'm not even sure whether to introduce it. But everything you've mentioned, you know, sort of dinosaur-looking creatures that you were clearly being observed by
a red Earth. Mm-hmm.
Sorry. You were clearly being
rust red terrain, like the graphic Mars, like a planetoid or an Earth-like pod of terrestrial realm out on that cosmic plane that the flat earthers would stipulate as possibly being the meta environment of our flat Earth. The only qualification being that when they found that place, or they were directed to point their teleporter that way, they were able to correlate, let's say, the pictures we were getting from 1976 forward on the whatever Mars was supposed to be with that location. In other words, they reached a rust red realm and called it Mars. Or the Mars that they've sent the rovers to has not been the red dot in the sky, but the terrestrial colony, whatever the terrestrial realm that's out there on the cosmic plane. It's entirely possible that's where they're sending us.
Yeah, and it's even bringing up the idea of Antarctica itself, and on a flat plane, if it's actually a ring of ice, how natural a phenomenon that is, or whether it was actually put in place. So let's, for just a second, play with the idea that this infinite flat plane, there were no barriers. It's just one big infinite flat plane with different communities on it, tribes, whatever we would call them, races, ETs, all of that. You know, you've got humans who've got this little plot of land, and you've got rays who've got that, and all of that. And whether from the inside or from the outside, what we refer to as the Ice Age was actually manufactured and created that ice barrier, that ice wall around it. Prior to it happening,
and let me just cite this.
There was a mass exodus.
Well, exactly.
Of dinosaurs,
actually,
of mammoths, of all of these other prehistoric animals, and of also civilizations of humans that supposedly have just disappeared. What if all they did was, hang on, this place is starting to get cold, and took off, and were locked out, and some were locked in? That's where my mind is going right now.
Right, my mind's spinning with some of the same implications. One of them being, if Antarctica, in fact, is an ice barrier that was put around our flat Earth to segregate it as a kind of a terrestrial realm, from the other settlement colonies on this cosmic plane. And this cosmic plane is infinite. You know, the creator God is like, just like us filling up little wells on a DNA distribution platform. You know, putting a little planetary realm here and then X number of light years over here, putting another one, et cetera, but on a flat plane rather than a heliocentric kind of universe. Then some of the implications are that the blood groupings, we have, for example, the Indo-European blood grouping of basically genetic commonality, you know, from Dublin to Jakarta, but there were always the two outliers or eccentric blood and linguistic groups on the whole Indo-European landmass, which were the Basques of Spain and the Finnic-Ugric blood group that produced the Finns and the Hungarians. The linguistic substrates are complete variants as well as the genetic substrates, and yet they're Homo sapiens sapiens. Maybe those were members of the other group that somehow slipped through and got agglomerated in isolated places when the Indo-European people were being settled on the greater Eurasian landmass that was arable or huntable as the glaciers were being forced to be propagated to keep the population in, like a big terrestrial penal colony. Another implication is that if you can look at Antarctica as a flat Earth girdling ice barrier, that there might be a matrix type quarantine that's in place when those who are trapped in one flat Earth scenario or another develop the technology to bore through the barrier and begin exploring one of the other sort of flat Earth-like development projects, call them terrestrial realms. And that's in fact what we encountered. We encountered the invisible barrier, the force field that Courtney Hunt and I encountered. We had evidence that we were being illuminated somehow during the night run from the ground up. So the evidence of fabrication, the evidence of artificiality, of holography, that are the exceptions to just the notion we were visiting the mere Mars, all support some kind of matrix quarantine scenario where we were not abiding by natural law. We were interlopers in a realm outside the boundaries of the flat Earth, and hence political targets. And that might explain some of the bizarre experiences that were directed at the jumpers, a pattern of car accidents on Earth, Men in Black type experiences, missing time, suppression of our project memories, and so forth. In other words, we may have been doing something incredibly controversial cosmically for the US government, which is going beyond the ambit of the Antarctic barrier. I'm trying to think of the name of that feature film where they do that at the end of the film. The Matrix trilogy was one of them, but there was that other one where the Matrix was much more contained into sort of a city.
Oh, the recent one.
Dark City?
Signal.
Was it Dark City?
Oh,
what's the name of it?
Dark City. There's one that was from the 80s, and then the more recent one was Signal. The Signal.
Signal. Okay, I haven't seen Signal yet, but I saw Dark City and the Matrix trilogy. So, if we live on a flat Earth, that again provides a ready explanation for why we were experiencing matrix quarantine when we were outside the ambit of the Earth. We were literally in one of the other settlement projects on the flat Earth.
Now you've taken me down this whole idea of the Ice Age and the Antarctic ring as being something that was actually manufactured, created.
Yeah, we were in a usufructuary Earth. We had left a usufructuary Earth. Sorry, I've got a bit of a tickle here. A usufructuary Earth, and we were on a usufructuary Mars, and we were violating natural law at that point, and we're targeted.
Oh, we have to.
We were being watched by a great ET.
Yeah, we have to bring in the other Matthew Boyland and others to see what they have to say about that. And have you had a chance to connect with any of them yet?
No, I haven't. We kind of things kind of got suspended or stagnated when we had sort of a philosophical falling out. It wasn't acrimonious in any way. We still remain the best of friends. You know, Brett adhered pretty much to a terrestrial Mars in real time, Bernie to a synthetic quantum environment Mars. And in my lectures, I presenting the notion of it was the real Mars, but reached via a form of exoplanetary holography in the way that I was visiting synthetically visiting real environments when I was being placed in the hologram of the chronovisors when I was a child participating in Project Pegasus. But in fact, they still don't answer those problems of how quickly we got to the terrestrial realm we were visiting, how we could have been getting there in a linear flight path, whether it was the actual Mars, and if it wasn't, what exactly was it and where exactly was it? Bernie never really described. He just gave the arbitrary explanation that, oh, over the years, you know, the Apollo astronauts spoke of these SQEs as being folds in time-space, and that there were 53 of them discovered thus far, but he never said where they were per se. He said in the Earth, in kind of hidden lands on the Earth, like valleys that people are prohibited from driving into because they open up into larger Earth. And then in space. One of the really amazing things I was confronted with during this whole process of analyzing this information, and I think it's a relevant analogy, is I was approached as an attorney by some smart filter developers to try to find venture capital for some cutting edge smart filter technologies they have. And they showed me a device that was about the size of the washer that would be in your faucet in your kitchen sink. And they said there were so many convolutions of facets of the smart filter within that washer that if you could spread their area out on the table, it would amount to about 16 by 16 inches. So there is this paradox of the vast contained within the microcosm, contained within the small. All you have to do is do the unfoldment properly, which is an incision problem that you or I could not do with the pen knife that we would use to slice our apple, the last apple that we ate, but that with cutting edge laser technology, you can actually create so many facets on a washer-shaped object that if spread out, they would be roughly 16 by 16 inches square on the table, which I just find mind-bending. So what Bernie was talking about was something similar on the on the macrocosm, which was, okay, from our perspective, we see the U.S. military, let's say, prohibiting motorists from going up a certain valley, but that when that valley is explored, it has more land in it than it should. He also described images taken of the Earth from space in which either 2 or 4 Earths were seen. So some kind of cosmic refraction is implied here, where there is actually more land in the cosmos than is indicated by the rote measure Copernican conception. So, but yet I was still dissatisfied with Bernard's explanation because I asked him, and he never really told me. I said, okay, where then were we going? Well, the flat earthers explained where we were going. We were shooting over the Antarctic ice shelf to some Mars-like environment that is another one of these contained terrestrial realms beyond the Earth. And this one seems to have been under a big geodesic dome, because that explains Barry shooting the flare up and hitting the ceiling, hitting the roof of the thing.
Well, this one may well be as well. I mean, have you come across in your research and what you've looked at so far with the flat Earth, the information that says that we've only really been up so far? You know, when it came to the atomic weapons that they've shot in space, when they showed the trajectory of all the rockets that they send off, there's evidence that we've only been up so far. Now, I don't...
Right, there's the evidence of trickery. Mm-hmm. Well, the evidence of trickery on Apollo 11, where they were simulating the spherical Earth by being about 100 miles in near-Earth orbit and putting a circular applique over the window to make it look like they were halfway between the Earth and the Moon. Yeah. Yeah, that's very compelling. What would cause the oxygen to stay adherent to the Earth if it was not under a dome, for example? Yes.
Yeah,
I counted that. That was maybe the fourth.
The whole atmosphere and the Earth just happening to stay in unison to such a degree that we don't feel the road. I mean, none of that makes sense to me. But I don't buy into the enclosed environment in the way some flat earthers are putting forward. That, see, unfortunately, even in this movement, not everybody's on the same page. But so you've got one concept of there's just Earth. That's all there is. There's nothing beyond, and it's in a contained environment like a snow dome. I don't adhere to that particular theory. However, I do believe that there is some kind. Yeah, sorry about this delay. I do believe that there is some kind of shield, firmament, whatever you want to call it, that is potentially artificially being created and put in place to create this isolated environment, but not that it's part of, say, God's creation. I'll put it that way. And now this whole line of thought that perhaps Antarctica isn't also put in place supports that for me in my mind. This is, I want to commend you. I think for you just being open and not wanting to stick to a particular line of thought in order to, corroborate anything you've said in the past or whatever. For you to be open to this, I think is brilliant. Not being that, what's the word? Invested in the idea that you actually went to that little globe that we see in the sky that we call Mars.
That's what we were told, but the evidence starts to stack up that something else was going on. And I was going to say, in regard to the notion of a domed Earth, it probably can't be that, because if we were shooting beyond the Antarctic ice ring to reach another terrestrial realm, we had to burrow through that, whatever it is. Maybe it's an electromagnetic dome, not a physical one, but an EM one. We definitely had the equipment to do that. So I think that the fact that we were jumping outside of planetary quarantine is telling. We were obviously under observation. We obviously encountered some kind of quarantine Mars, whatever terrestrial environment it was. I believe that Bernard's telling the truth when he cites Ed Dame's claim that they had discovered that it wasn't the actual Mars. So that leaves open this whole line of inquiry. And no, I've never been dedicated to dogmatically asserting that my worldview is accurate and that that's what I'm in the business of truth-telling about. I've been trying to pursue the actual truth. And that's why I even entertained the disagreements between the three of us about where we were going. But I was just struck by how the major substrates of doubt, this major questions as to what we were actually experiencing in the Mars Jump Room program, are much more amenable to ready explanation by the flat Earth conception of the cosmos rather than the round Earth one. Hands down.
Hands down.
I think one would have to be intellectually dishonest to say otherwise. Yeah, hands down, it makes more sense that model is valid. I was also struck by how photorealistic they can make the Earth seem when in fact they're relying on drawings. All you have to do is sit through maths demonstration of paintings and photographs to see that our eyes are not really able to discern a painting from a photograph and a photograph from a painting. They're not.
And like Matt says, you cannot say the Earth is a globe without bringing NASA into it.
Mm-hmm.
Without mentioning NASA.
Absolutely.
That's all we got.
Well, when you're a child in school, how do you develop your conception of a heliocentric cosmos, a heliocentric solar system. Basically, the advent of heliocentrism is told to you as a set of historical events, such as the career of Nicholas Copernicus of Poland. And then you're told about, you're given astronomy, and then you're shown several NASA photographs. And suddenly it's QED in your mind that you live on a round planet. But that's a reality that you never experience as a human being aboard this Earth, whichever it is. I'm not asserting that we live on a flat Earth. I'm just saying that those who have argued that utterly heretical position have impressed me with the logic and the cogency of their arguments. And so when I began then applying their conception of a non-heliocentric, a flat solar system, a flat Earth, with a same-sized Earth and Moon and lights that we call planets operating dynamically above it as a kind of a planetarium above it, I said, well, this solves all the abiding mysteries of the jump room program, at least those that we've identified, with the additional caveat that if you get really paranoid and you get your mind, you grok the fact that you've been subjected to a multi-generational conspiracy to conceal the true nature of the solar system that's now going on for 500 years, and that there must be some control group that has created this planetary worldview in the Earth population. Let's say, again, a multi-generational conspiracy of Freemasons or whatever, some kind of oligarchical governing body, maybe under the royal families, maybe under the nation states, who knows, maybe both, maybe under the Vatican. You then have to factor in, well, where was there evidence that we were violating some kind of cosmic protocol? Well, it was when we were in Mars. It wasn't when we were leaving Earth. It was when we were exploring Mars that we were surveilled by the great ET, that we were subjected to force fields that didn't allow us to go farther. So
they didn't
that is
interfere
readily
with you
explainable as, well, they didn't shoot anything at us. They didn't war on us. They didn't repel us with weaponry. But in the case of the force fields, it was not a question of whether we were going to go any further. They were impenetrable force fields that we sometimes encountered on Mars. So if it was merely a terrestrial realm, a planetary, spheroidal, terrestrial realm on another planet that we were exploring, how could there have been force fields interposed? Especially when the humanoid life forms were living primarily underground, cooperatively, but primarily underground. So who was controlling the matrix quarantine that we were subjected to? And the answer to that under the flat Earth model would be the operators of the matrix that are sustaining the flat Earth model, while for some reason hoodwinking the Earth population about the fact that, making us think we believe that we're living on a spheroidal planet that's going around the sun. Oh, and by the way, I was going to mention,
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that in conceiving of the matrix notion of a matrix-driven reality, a matrix-governed flat Earth reality, I had always said, I'll believe it when you show me the Levi's label in the grass. When you show me the signature of God, when I can have that Truman Show moment and see that it's an artificial terrestrial realm that we're living in. Well, I would aver to the adherence of the round Earth. What about Norman Bergeron's exceptional research into the ring makers of Saturn? If the rings of Saturn are literally being propagated by a machine that we can literally film, and if the rings of Saturn, by implication, the rings of Saturn are not a natural formation explainable by different evolutionary theories of planetary ecology, if they are in fact a usufructory machine that's being generated by machines, that is the Levi's label in the grass. Norman Bergeron's work on the ring makers of Saturn. That's the plug that the Truman Show producers weren't supposed to let you see. That would explain why Norman Bergeron was in risk of his life, why he actually went into hiding and conceals his whereabouts. Because in his work, we find that human being who was intelligent enough and persistent enough to literally find the Levi's label in the grass, namely the fact that the rings of Saturn are being made by a machine and are not the natural formation of an unguided universe.
I'm going to have to look into that one. I haven't come across his work yet.
Right? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. If Norman Berggren's work on the ring makers of Saturn indicate that the ring around Saturn is being kind of generated by gemstones or ice crystals or dust or whatever, some kind of synthetic process, and there are these huge Vimana-shaped gargantuan extraterrestrial craft that are in the rings, not mining them, but actually generating them. That is the telltale element of the Matrix. That's the Levi's, blue jeans label in the grass. After the Truman Show came out, the cynics always said, yes, but if we are living in this phony reality, like these science fiction writers, your Philip K. Dicks and novelists like that believe they found that we live in a fabricated cosmos, essentially a machine that's been invented or is being invented as we experience it. Show me the evidence. Show me the label of the creator that wasn't supposed to be seen. Well, there it is. The ring makers of Saturn. Are you there, Lisa? Lisa? Hello?
Sorry, everybody. I had a Wi-Fi disruption. Um, Andrew, I mean, the reason this is coming out now, all of this flat Earth information, I mean, there has to be a reason for it. It's as if we are seeing this matrix, this illusion, more and more for what it is. And people like yourself who have had these experiences in all different areas of secret black ops, underground programs, if they're not as invested in their story and can be open-minded and look at this, I think we may be able to really put a lot of pieces of this puzzle together. I don't know if you're aware, but Matthew Boylan is actually in the process now of trying to get the funding to actually do an expedition to prove one way or the other, to start at one point in the south and go directly underneath in a straight line and come up at the other side if it's a ball, if it's a globe. He's put a lot of thought and research into how to go about it and try to put an end to this discussion one way or the other. I don't like his chances of being permitted to do such a thing at this point. I mean, even fishing vessels who get too close get, bombed out of the oceans down there. So what has come out of all of this, though, so far, whether people buy into it being a flat Earth or not, is that there are questions that need to be answered. Like, why is Antarctica such a no-go zone? Why? What is down there? Why does it require 47 nations to patrol and protect it? Why are we destroying and mining and resource hungry to the point of destruction? Why are we looking at going into national parks and national forests and wildlife heritage areas when it was stated many, many years ago that down there is resource rich? Why are we not going down there? I mean, we're talking about some of the greediest corporations on the planet prepared to do so much destruction, and yet they're not going down there. I mean, these are simple questions that have come up that require answers, whether the Earth is flat, a round, a triangle, a cube, or whatever it is. It's brought up questions with some really, really compelling video evidence, among other things, as to what's really going on with NASA and what we're being shown. Like Matthew with his painting, picture, or or video, whether it's looking at the footage that comes from the so-called ISS space station and the ridiculousness that goes on there, whether it's that gentleman whose name escapes me who tracked down all of the past astronauts who say they walked on the moon and asked them to swear on the Bible and got his head beaten in for it.
Bart Sibrel.
Yeah, the violent reactions from these men. And that alone actually is really, really interesting. I mean, if you've been an astronaut for all these years and you are in on the conspiracy, the lie that they walked on the moon, and you've managed to adhere to that story for 20, 30, 40 years, however long it's been since some of them went up there, whether they walked on the moon or not, why not? And most of them are supposedly good Christians. So why not swear on the Bible?
Well, if one of them was a PhD in astrophysics, namely astronaut Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong had the status of being the first person to walk on the moon after being one of the most distinguished test pilots in the history of the U.S. Navy, I believe the Navy, perhaps the Air Force, and then Michael Collins was the key support person. How could it be that when Bart Sibrel, the filmmaker you're referring to, approached each of those astronauts, that Neil Armstrong, basically joked and said, knowing you, Mr. Sabrell, that Bible is probably not a Bible that you're asking me to swear on. Edwin Aldrin punched him in the face, and Michael Collins evaded him to the point of looking kind of like a lunatic doing so. Why wouldn't any three or all three of them be able to stand there and say, if you doubt we went to the moon, consider the three following facts? And they weren't able to do that. I think any one of us, if we had walked on the moon, we would have, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Come up for an explanation of different anomalies that those who believe that we didn't reach the moon, didn't walk on the moon, have raised. You'd probably be somewhat schooled in the contraposition at that point, and be able to calmly stand there with all of your dignity intact as a member of the trio, the team that supposedly first placed human life on the moon, and be able to give a realistic answer. Hold on. And yet, that was the response. Essentially a joke, fisticuffs, and evasion of the interview. Now, of course, Bart Sabrell used somewhat of...
Well, this goes back to what you were saying before. I mean, what do they then know about the Creator in order for that book to scare the living shit out of them the way it did? What do they know? Or what is it that they're frightened of? What's in that book that to them has repercussions, such severe repercussions, to resort to violence in one case?
I might not be able to articulate this because I don't have I only have a Master of Philosophy from Cambridge, not a PhD. But let me hazard an explanation of the world we live in which religion, philosophy, and science are not integrated. The near-death literature, which is very rich at this point, the reincarnation and near-death literature is abounding with evidence that while we are mortal in any particular life, we possess an eternal soul. To me, the implication of that is that the matrix model of the Earth, we could conceive of the Earth as, or any particular lifetime we're born into, as kind of a machine. I like to call it, I borrow a term from the physiocrats, of a usufruct, that the Earth is not an arbitrary accident of arbitrary cosmic forces, but is essentially what Shakespeare said it was. He said all the world is a stage, but then he named his theater the Globe, which is maybe a little bit of irony there. But basically that it's almost as if what they were trying to conceal was the fact that the Earth is a divinely constructed artificial realm, and the attempt to position it as a natural realm and a spherical reality was essentially an attempt to introduce science so that science would completely supplant religion. But what is religion? Religion is a linking back, right? Religio, from the Latin, to link back to fundamental truths. And so, in fact, the religious conception of reality is more consistent with what the near-death and the reincarnation literature is showing us, which is that at physical death, our souls, or our minds, if you will, leave the body and return to the Godhead and undergo a cosmic process involving between life states. So in a sense, the scientific post-Copernican worldview attempts to ungod reality and also describe the Earth as sort of this accidental usufruct, not usufruct, but this accidental natural body that has been in existence for millions of years. And yet the evidence suggests otherwise. Also, I would factor in the anomalous findings that are made, where you have like a spark plug in a coal seam or something like that. There have been a number of anomalous findings Michael Cremo and others have identified, in which some technological implement is found in some natural formation that is hundreds of thousands or millions of years old. So these may be clues, in fact, that the Earth has been fabricated, and that it's fabricated basically for us and other creatures to live on during this particular phase of our evolution, but that the whole notion that it's some eternal, perpetual, unguided scientific realm is just not true. And for some reason, there was an attempt by some secret society, maybe what we today call the Illuminati, maybe the conspiracy that Adam Weishaupt started in 1776 in Munich.
To me, it's starting to feel like
York Rite Freemasonry.
To me, it's starting to feel like this particular little piece of territory gets renovated literally every couple of hundred years. A new story inserted and a new experiment takes place. And I'm actually at that point where I feel like it's every couple of hundred years. And I know how ludicrous that sounds right now. But I question everything we're told as history, as our human history, as there's just too many anomalies. And from all the ancient cultures and civilizations that we find under the oceans, and like you've said, these technologies that just do not belong in rock or in caves or whatever that supposedly have thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, and we've got stuff that we've discovered stuff that we can't figure out yet. We don't have the technology. It's almost like a computer game, and the software program gets wiped, a new software program gets reinserted, and we start over. It gets, whether it's an upgrade or a downgrade or just a whole new game, who knows? But there are so many questions that are coming up right now, and I'm fascinated by this whole idea of an infinite plane. To me, it answers so many questions, not just the anomalies from your own personal experience, but so many. But I have to say that we've actually gone 10 minutes over, and I'm really appreciative that you reached out to have this conversation, because I'm hoping it will actually prompt others with similar experiences to yourself to start coming forward and joining the conversation. I'm hoping they also find answers to questions that they may have themselves, because I know that there's many out there, and I would love one of you guys who are in the official program, space agencies or whatever, to get involved and start talking. But thank you, Andrew. And can I ask, off topic, but when do you officially nominate yourself for president, running for president for 2016?
Well, I'm being pressured a lot to actually file and declare right now. And actually, the tradition in the American presidency is to announce and run in the final year of the term of the previous administration. So, for example, Ronald Reagan announced in November of 1979 and then was elected in November of 80. Senator Robert F. Kennedy announced on March 16th of 1968, and then sadly was assassinated in June of 68, but that would be for the November 1968 election, literally within 8 months of the election. And let me just cite another example. Bill Clinton announced in October of 1991, 13 months before the November 1992 election. So I'm going to follow that example, that customary practice, and probably announce in November of this year and run for a year. And I mean really run with 100 YouTubes, 200 cities, giving speeches in 200 cities, because I think I can achieve a major upset in the history of the U.S. presidency, which would be to achieve a plurality of, let's say, a 40-30-30 split. If the Republican Party and the Democratic Party do what they seem poised to do, which is nominate Jeb Bush of Florida and Hillary Clinton of New York to be their standard bearers, because both of them are associated with the dynasties that over the last 25 years have brought America to where we are, which is to the threshold of being enslaved in a police state in which local and state police have been federalized and militarized, and they are extremely vulnerable as candidates. So I think that I can achieve a plurality, which would then throw the election into the House of Representatives, and God knows what would happen there. But I think it's possible that an independent, if not myself, another candidate, will do what hasn't been done since George Washington, which is win the presidency without major party support. At this point, and the reason I say that is not just because I recently went from 500 to 1 odds to 50 to 1 odds at Paddy Power in Dublin, Ireland, but because half of the eligible electorate is not voting in the United States, and of the half that is voting for president, half of that group now describes itself as independent with a capital I. But we have no independent party in the United States. That means that the Democratic and Republican Party share the remaining 25% of the electorate, and hence only have committed constituencies of at most about 12.5%. It's probably a little bit biased towards the Democrats. So I'm going to be announcing in November with the intent to win this election. And we may see an historical upset. I think Governor Ventura could have been that person, but I think he took himself out of the race when he announced that he was going to be asking Howard Stern, the shock jock, to be his vice presidential running mate. I'm going to, by contrast,
Well,
I'm going to select somebody. Right. I'm going to select somebody who's ready to be president should something happen to me. So I'll be announcing probably November, December timeframe and running really hard for a year. And that really is consistent with the tradition of the American presidency.
Well, all the best. Good luck with it. And thank you again for joining.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on. Thank you.
All right. Talk soon. Bye for now.